Most people only ever buy bias tape, but you actually don't have to. You can make bias tape, and even without buying a single tool. Although whether you should really depends on how much time you have. I'll quickly cover what bias tape is and why you might want to make your own, then walk you through the full process. From a totally free method to the one I actually recommend if you're busy. Hi, I'm Victoria, and I help you sew practical, stylish accessories ready for real life. I'm going to start with a fat quarter of fabric. And before we do any cutting, I'm just going to press it flat. You don't have to use a fat quarter, but it's a really clean, beginner-friendly way to get straight bias strips. And it lets us use most of the fabric without overcomplicating things. Pressing it first just makes everything easier and more accurate when we start cutting. While I'm pressing this out, let's quickly talk about what bias tape actually is. Bias tape is basically a trim or binding. It comes in single fold or double fold. Single fold is usually more decorative, but I almost always use double fold because it wraps around an edge and hides the raw edges inside, which is perfect for craft projects and practical accessories. You'll see how both happen in this process, but everything we're doing is really fixed on double fold. And if you're wondering what bias means, it just means cutting on the 45-degree angle of the fabric. Woven fabric doesn't stretch much, but on the bias, it has a little bit more give, which is what lets it curve smoothly around the edges. Now, if any of that feels confusing, I've got a sewing terms video linked here, but that's all that you really need to know for this. Now, before we get into the cutting, you may be wondering, why would I even want to make my own bias tape in the first place? The biggest reason is that store-bought bias tape is pretty limiting. It only comes in solid colors, and it's hard to get something that actually matches your fabric. You might have green, but not that green, and definitely not prints. It also comes in small packages that don't go nearly as far as you might expect. And continually buying packs adds up. But when you make your own bias tape, you can use whatever fabric you want, make as little or as much as you want, whenever you need it. You're not boxed in by what happens to be available at the store. I'll also say that handmade bias tape tends to be a little bit more flexible. Because it hasn't been pre-stiffened, it usually curves more smoothly and lays better around the edges than the ready-made kind. Store-bought bias tape definitely has its place. But if you want more control, better matching, and you want something that works with you instead of against you, then making your own is worth knowing how to do. All right, now let's cut our fabric out on the bias. All right, now we're ready for step 1, which is cutting the fabric on the bias. I'm starting with my fabric right side up and laying flat. I'm going to take the bottom corner and fold it up until it meets the opposite edge so the sides line up and I get a triangle like this. I'm just smoothing everything out, and then I'll add a clip or two at the top so nothing shifts while I'm cutting. Since a fat quarter isn't a perfect square, you'll have a strip of fabric left over here. This part isn't needed, so I'm just going to cut it off and then set it aside for scraps. Next, I'm going to cut along the folded edge to separate these into 2 triangles. I'm just going to turn the fabric so it's easier to cut, and then I will just cut right along this fold. Now I'm going to fold this corner up to make a triangle sandwich just so that it'll be easier to cut. Now I'm just going to line up my triangle on the right angle to make it easier to cut the strips. I'm going to cut 2-inch wide strips. That's because I want 1/2-inch wide double fold bias tape. As a general rule, you'll want your starting strip to be 4 times the width of your finished double fold bias tape. From here, I'm just cutting as many strips as I can across the triangle. As you get towards the end, you'll end up with some smaller pieces. I usually keep cutting as much as possible so I'm not wasting fabric. Next, I'm going to start joining them together. I'm going to start by squaring off the edges of 2 strips so they're nice and straight. I'm laying 1 strip right side up. Then I'm taking a second strip and placing it right side down, lining the ends up at the right angle so they form a corner. Now I'm drawing a diagonal line from one corner of the overlap to the opposite corner, basically corner to corner. Next, I'm going to sew a straight stitch along that line and, of course, back stitching at the beginning and end. Now I'm just going to trim off the excess, leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I'll flip the strip over so that everything is right side up, open the seam, and press it flat. You should end up with one continual strip with a diagonal seam. Now I recommend joining the strips one at a time. I've tried pinning a whole bunch of strips at once before, and every time I do that, I end up with at least one strip flipped the wrong way. And you don't realize it until you open everything up and have to undo it. Trust me, doing them one at a time takes way less time than having to seam rip it open and redo it. Once you start making your own bias tape, there's one problem that nobody talks about. No one really tells you what to do with it. It doesn't come neatly wrapped on cardboard, and it very quickly turns into a tangled drawer situation. That's why I made my bias tape storage cards. They're sturdy, laminated chipboard, not flimsy cardstock. Each set comes with 6 cards and 6 clips, and you can hang them, stack them, and even stand them up like mini fabric bolts. They give you a clean way to wrap and store the bias tape or piping that you already took the time to make, so it stays neat, visible, and actually usable next time. If you make your own bias tape, or you think you might someday, they're available in my shop on my website. I'll have it linked below if you want to check them out. All right, back to the video. From here, there are 2 ways to finish bias tape. I'll start with the no tool, totally free method. Then, if you're like me and you're short on time, I'll show you the way that I actually recommend. All right, this no tool method is free and super simple. It just takes time and patience. I have one continuous long strip now, and I'm going to grab my iron for the next step. First, I'm folding it in half lengthwise and pressing that crease all the way down the strip. Once that's done, I'll open it back up and fold each side in toward the center crease I just made. From there, I fold it back along that original crease and press again. At this point, all the raw edges are enclosed. Because the strip is so long, I usually do these last 2 steps together in sections. Fold the sides in, refold, press, and then continue down the line instead of trying to keep everything perfectly folded all at once. I'll also pin as I go just to help hold its shape while I'm working down the rest of the strip and while it cools. And that's all there is to method 1. You just keep repeating that process until the entire strip is pressed. It gets the job done, but it's not the most efficient. Now, there is a way to do this that's much faster, more consistent, and takes a lot of the pain out of the process. And that's what I'll show you next. So now I'm going to show you the method that I actually recommend if you're busy, using a bias tape maker. Now this does involve a tool, but it makes the whole process much faster, easier, and way more consistent. Bias tape makers come in different sizes, and you can buy one size individually or a small set. There are also kits that include multiple sizes and a few extra tools. I've linked a couple of options below if you want to check them out. The most common sizes are a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, and 1 inch, which in millimeters are 6, 12, 18, and 25, which is what you'll likely see on the packaging. I have 3 of those, 1 inch or 25 millimeters, a 1/2 inch or 12 millimeters, and a 1/4 inch at 6 millimeters. But I never really use the smaller ones. Bias tape makers make single fold bias tape. If you want double fold, you'll just have to fold it in half one more time. So your starting strip needs to be 4 times the width of your double fold bias tape. For this demo, I'm using the 1 inch bias tape maker. That's why we cut 2 inch strips. They go into a 1 inch bias tape maker, which gives you a 1/2 inch double fold bias tape. All right, here's how it works. I'm going to grab the second strip of fabric I cut. Before I feed it through the bias tape maker, I'm going to trim one end to a point. It doesn't have to be perfect. This just makes it way easier to feed through the tool. Now to start, you slide the fabric into the back of the bias tape maker underneath the internal guide. I usually use an awl or seam ripper to help pull it through the slot at the top. Some sizes have a slot underneath, like my 1/4 inch one, so you might have to flip it over. Once it starts coming out the front, you'll see the fabric folding on its own. I'm just going to pull a few inches through, grab the little handle, and slide the tool back and away so I can start pressing. Now, I press right behind the bias tape maker while I pull it along. If the strip slips out from under the iron at first, just pull a little more through and press again. Once you're a few inches in, it usually stays put. If it's still fighting you, you can pin it lightly to the ironing board to keep it in place while you move the tool. The key is keeping the iron close to the tool so it doesn't have time to unfold. And depending on how long your strip is, you might need to stop and reposition it once or twice, but it's still way faster than doing it the manual way. At this point, you've got single fold bias tape. To turn it into double fold, I just fold it in half one more time along that center crease and press. I'll pin it as I go and let it cool for a minute so the fold really sets. If you found this video helpful, please hit the like button and subscribe for more practical sewing content. And if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!